Good morning and good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is the common phrase everybody's using these days on these global Zoom meetings. My time is 1 minute past 3. I think we've all been quite good at using these digital arenas to log on pretty exactly on time. So I think I'll just start this this meeting, and it's my honor to give you all a warm welcome. My name is Erik Gjerski. I'm the head of the Action Platform on Sustainable Ocean Business at the UN Global Compact. We are here today to launch the new brief on accelerating sustainable seafood. It's a result of one of our sprints, the short, effective meeting format that we use at the UN Global Compact, where we have a concrete challenge and we try to have a singular outcome with recommendations that we are now today on the seafood brief. This will be available in the chat and on our website. We have lots of great speakers here today that will discuss this outcome and the way forward for the seafood industries. And before I give the floor to Wenche and JB, they will moderate today's event, let me just recap why we are here. This is actually also a first meeting of what we call at the UN Global Compact the Blue Road to COP26. The COP26 will be this year's main political event, and rightly so. It's the major stepping stone for the world to really deliver on the Paris Climate Agreement, and also in a bigger, broader sense on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. All of this is, of course, interconnected. And what we have seen lately, really, is the rise of the role of the ocean. That has never been more important when it comes to both climate and sustainability. And what we will discuss today, more particularly, is the key role that the seafood industry will be playing. Now, the UNGC, who are we? Not everybody is familiar with the UN Global Compact. Established 20 years ago by Kofi Annan, we are the largest sustainability initiative, a UN agency for the corporate sector, a multi-stakeholder organization comprising 12,000 businesses, but also NGOs, academic institutions, and you sign up by signing the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact, committing to report on environmental, labor, human rights issues, and anti-corruption. Do that if you haven't signed up to the UN Global Compact. Our organization is chaired by Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, and he's very clear on the role of business, because governments and UN institutions cannot walk this road alone. We have to do it together with corporate sector and the finance sector. So our objective in the Sustainable Ocean Business Platform is to bring a multi-stakeholder group together so that we can navigate on what we call the Stewardship 2030 Roadmap, also available online. And we work with specialized UN agencies, all the leading companies out there, but also through small and medium enterprises in our local networks to understand what are the challenges, what are the opportunities for the ocean sectors. We have set a very clear baseline with the Sustainable Ocean Principles, launched at the UN General Assembly in 2019. You should sign up to these principles, showing your employees, your clients, and your governments that you are serious about your role in reporting and recognizing your impact on the environment, on the social issues, labor issues, and sharing of data and insights on the ocean. It's a huge, important baseline for us to move forward in a correct way. We also have very clear ambitions at the platform, at the UN Global Compact, when it comes to the role of the ocean. At large, we see 5 key areas. We have to decarbonize shipping. We have to harness renewable ocean electricity. We have to end waste entering the ocean. We have to increase our ocean science and data sharing. And of course, what we will discuss here today, we need more and more sustainable seafood. It will be a key element for the road ahead. We need more and better policies and regulations to do this, but also, and maybe more importantly, in the short term at least, we need the finance sector to recognize this and have good frameworks to really invest and drive sustainable ocean seafood. This is why we created the framework of blue bonds. And this is something we've done with the World Bank system and private banks and the corporate sector, so that we can recognize what are the major opportunities. Reach out for us for more information on this. I think it's a super opportunity to be part of this great industrial reformation, transformation that we will see in the next few years. This report that we will discuss today will also be informing the UN Food Systems Summit taking place in September. It will be a key issue for us at the COP26. And to tell you more about this and to moderate this event today, I'll have the pleasure to introduce my good friends, Wenche Gronbrekk, Head of Sustainability and Risk at Cermaq, and Baptiste Jouffray, researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Eric. And again, a warm welcome to everyone. My name is Baptiste Jouffray, and I'm a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre at Stockholm University. Today, it is my pleasure to moderate this webinar together with Wenche Gronbrekk, Head of Sustainable Development at Cermaq Group. The report we will be discussing today, as Eric said, is entitled Accelerating Sustainable Seafood, and it is the result of a sprint convened last December by the UN Global Compact. The concept of the sprint is to be an action-oriented short work stream taking place within 1 month and with the aim to accelerate progress on a specific ocean stewardship topic. In this case, sustainable seafood. So over the course of 3 calls, about 50 stakeholders from policy, business, science, and finance discussed how the sustainable development of the seafood sector could be accelerated. The first meeting focused on the role of measurement, including the tools and means to enable effective comparison of seafood companies and assess what is sustainable seafood, how to measure it. The second meeting focused on the role of finance and how both traditional and innovative financial mechanisms can play a key role in driving the sustainable development of the sector. Finally, the last meeting focused on the role of policy and regulatory frameworks, making clear that governments are essential to catalyze action and create a level playing field for the seafood value chain. Throughout all 3 meetings, there was one resounding theme: the idea that shifting towards sustainability will require a collective and collaborative effort across the entire seafood value chain, from policymakers and regulatory bodies to business, producers, civil society, the scientific community, and the financial industry. The conclusions of the report are based on inputs received during these meetings, as well as written submissions afterwards. Needless to say that we're incredibly grateful to the many comments we received. Now, in the interest of time, we will only briefly present the 6 key enablers that were identified, but we won't be able to do justice to the level of details, the specific challenges, and the concrete recommendation that you can find in the report. So this short overview of the 6 key enablers, as we call them, is to get the conversation started and hear reflection from our distinguished panelists. But I do encourage you to read the report for more details. And let's get straight into it. The first key enabler, maybe the least novel one, involves the improved utilization and ratification of existing framework. A series of regulatory frameworks are already in place to support government action. What they need is to be ratified and enforced. I'm thinking, for instance, about ratifying international conventions, such as the Port State Measure Agreements and the ILO Work in Fishing Convention, both of which are paramount in the fight against illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Harnessing their supporting instruments and utilizing meta-governmental framework, such as the FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, can enable a global push towards sustainable seafood. So we have a lot of tools, they exist, we don't necessarily need to invent new ones, we need to ratify and enforce them. There is a role there for policymakers, there is also a role there for financial institutions to use those frameworks as a reference and as minimum requirements to allocate finance. And of course, both financial institutions and companies can use their voice and their power to speak to governments and regulators and push them to be bolder and enforce and ratify those. The second key enabler concerns ensuring a socially sustainable seafood sector. I believe it was Jim Lip who put it simply at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2019, saying, if your seafood is caught by slaves, it doesn't matter if it's sustainable. So what we mean by sustainable seafood in the report and throughout the discussion really is seafood that is both environmentally and socially sustainable. And there too, policymakers can implement mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, and we're seeing it happen and gaining traction in some of the countries. Financial institutions as well can advocate for human rights due diligence legislation and use international human rights standards as condition for financing. Both aquaculture and fisheries companies can rely on benchmarks, such as the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark and the World Benchmarking Alliance Seafood Stewardship Index. And last but not least, sustainability-related services, such as certification and labeling schemes, need to incorporate that social dimension much more into what is considered sustainable seafood. The third enabler is about unlocking sustainable finance. And this is two-dimensional. On the one hand, there is a need to unlock finance and increase capital where it's lacking. And I'm thinking, for instance, the cost of overcoming short-term cost of sustainability measures that can be barriers for some players. You often hear about the ocean finance gap, and SDG 14 is indeed one of the least financed goals. In this context, multilateral banks, for instance, can enter into partnerships with commercial banks to enhance investor confidence and create the enabling environment. This is where impact investment, development finance, and blended financial mechanisms really fit. But there is a second dimension to financing sustainable seafood, which is to act as gatekeepers and ensure investment are directed towards more sustainable practices and decent working conditions. So the power of financial institutions, from stock exchanges and creditors to insurance companies and private equity, is to leverage their power and influence sustainability by deciding what to finance and under which conditions. And this requires the incorporation of non-financial sustainability factors into the financial risk system and the continued analysis of how social ecological risk translate into financial risk. And this is to align incentives, right? Finance needs to realize and propose services that take into consideration non-financial risk as well, or what is thought as non-financial risk, but in fact is ultimately. I'll stop there and turn towards my colleague Wenche.
Thank you, Jean-Baptiste. And I'd like to just remind everyone, if you want to have a look at the details here and some of the recommendations, there's a link shared in the chat to the brief that was just released earlier today. The three next enablers, they they focus on the availability of data, transparency versus performance, and also the role of seafood in the sustainable food system. The fourth enabler is access to high quality, standardized, non-financial data. And this is not typical for seafood, of course. Quality data through the value chain is so important to inform decision-making, both within organizations and for investors assessing the sustainability of companies or sectors. So there is a scope for enhanced non-financial reporting throughout the supply chain, strengthening of ESG benchmarks and indexes through standardized reporting and KPIs. The fifth enabler deals with the fact that transparency in data alone does not necessarily equate to performance. And yes, transparency is important. We know the seafood industry is doing quite well here relative to, for example, other livestock production, as shown by the Fair Protein Producer Index. But we know we also need to go beyond transparency, from quantifying progress to rewarding performance. So moving beyond just disclosure, which is important, but we also have to think ahead. Quantifying progress and rewarding performance are important next steps. And finally, the sixth enabler concerns the importance of recognizing the present and future role of seafood in sustainable food systems. We have several upcoming summits this year. One is the UN Food System Summit, so it's scheduled for this fall, which is an opportunity both to catalyze coordinated action in food policy, which is really needed to bridge sustainable food production with nutritional needs. An important piece here is, of course, to strengthen the recognition of seafood in this food system debates as a whole, both as a climate-friendly and healthy contribution. So that was a summary of the 6 enablers as presented in the brief, where there's also more information for you to dive into. I think without further ado, we're gonna present our speakers, Jean-Baptiste, and ask all of them to turn their videos on, their cameras on. So we'll have an exciting panel discussion coming up. With the opportunity for each panelist to really reflect a little bit on the sprint outcomes, on the 6 enablers, and also, you know, what are your role in this to advance the enablers in this decade of action. So let's start with you, Audun. Audun Lem, you're the Deputy Director of the Fisheries Division of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. What is the FAO's role in accelerating sustainable seafood?
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me, and we are very keen on this dialogue to continue. We feel it contributes a lot to the global agenda on these issues, and we are very pleased to be able to contribute as much as we can. Regarding the different sprints, all the enablers, of course, are important for reaching them. And even though they're all important, I'd like to focus in my intervention here first on enabler 1, the ratification, regulatory compliance, and meta governance. And let us remind us that the regulatory framework is dynamic and it's evolving. So it's not just a question of implementing what is there, it's also to develop it further and to ensure that the toolbox which is available is more and more tuned and effective in implementing the various activities that have to be implemented to reach SDGs and to reach us, to enable us to get sustainable seafood. Let me also highlight that last week in Rome, we celebrated during COFI, the Committee on Fisheries, the 25th anniversary of the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries. And the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries has been the main global instrument for developing international guidelines and tools to ensure the effective conservation, management, utilization, and development of living aquatic resources, with due respect for the ecosystem and biodiversity. Now, the most recent of all these of importance is the Port State Measures Agreement, but there are many others, including the small-scale fisheries guidelines, the guidelines for catch documentation schemes, on eco-labeling, etc., and a number of plans of actions. And now being developed, for example, are the guidelines on transshipment and also on best practice in aquaculture. So again, it's a developing, enlarging, evolving regulatory framework out there. And although countries are aware of the need for effective fisheries management, to implement efficient fisheries management systems remains a challenge in all regions of the world, both in developed and in developing countries. And it's therefore not only important, but it's incredibly encouraging that last week in Rome during the Committee on Fisheries meeting, all countries endorsed the 2021 COFI Declaration on Sustainable Fisheries and Aquaculture. It's very encouraging. All countries endorsed this. And this underlines how we need to ensure that our aquatic food systems are resilient, that they're able to meet growing demand for nutritious, safe, and affordable food, while maintaining sustainable ecosystems, economies, and societies that leave no one behind. Now, that was all the first enabler. The second one, on ensuring socially sustainable seafood sector. In this, I'd like to stress that FAO always focuses on both the social, the economic, and the environmental dimensions of sustainable development. And again, during COFI, countries called on FAO to continue the work on developing fisheries and aquaculture specific, so not just generic, but aquaculture and fisheries specific practical guidance on social responsibility in value chains based on existing international instruments and guidelines, so not developing something new, but to include everything that is out there which is relevant for fisheries and aquaculture and put them into one framework which is practical and can be used for companies. And also, we requested to strengthen international cooperation on occupational health and safety issues in the fisheries and aquaculture sectors, working together with ILO and IMO and others. And since there have been already many references, for example, to the ILO Convention 188, I just checked this morning, and so far in the world, only 18 countries have ratified this. So as a number of countries still have to be persuaded to implement Convention 188, which is fundamental if we want to ensure that fisheries, capture fisheries around the world, are sustainable also from a social dimension. Now, and third, the third enabler I'd like to mention is the enabler 4 on high quality standardized non-financial data. As Wenche mentioned, to have precise, reliable data is fundamental. It's fundamental not only, for example, to report on progress under the SDGs, but also to implement the actions that are needed in order to achieve the SDGs in general, but specifically also on fisheries. That is also a fundamental importance for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audun. It's interesting reflections and surely some remaining challenges, but also some very important progress being made. So that's great to hear. Our next speaker is Marisa Drew, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Global Head of Sustainability Strategy, Advisory and Finance at Credit Suisse. Marisa, what are your reflections on the enablers for accelerating sustainable seafood?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much for having me. A delight to be here. So in my role, I represent a host of interventions, I would say, in finance that can be applied to the sustainable seafood arena. On the one hand, I'm supporting and often advising people who invest capital, either as individuals through our private bank or institutional investors who are investing big pools of capital. So helping to advise them and direct how that capital is put to work can be critical in this role, and I'll touch on that in a little more depth. I also, through our investment bank, look after capital raisings for the corporates themselves. So in so doing, maybe setting standards for how companies are held to account for where that money is invested and on what terms. And then finally, with my CSO hat on, my Chief Sustainability Officer hat on, I look at Credit Suisse's own activities as an enterprise, including our loan book. So the loans that we provide, what conditions do we put on those loans that can be directed? So in that respect, I'd like to touch on the 3 of the interventions in the report. The number 2, which is ensuring a socially sustainable seafood sector. Number 3, unlocking sustainable finance, probably fairly obvious. And then number 5, which is beyond transparency from progress to really paying for performance. So how are these intertwined? I like to reflect whenever you have something that is profound as the pandemic, and think about what lessons has the pandemic taught us. And what I would tell you from the finance community is that this moment of reflection that we've all had as we're all in lockdown, to ask ourselves, what have we learned from the pandemic? The key takeaway in my mind, which I hope can be a positive outcome of all of this, is that the linkage between the E and the S, the investment community is drawing those linkages very, very clearly. So when we talk about ESG investing or sustainable investing, investors now are actually asking about the S. So when they are defining where to put capital, they not only ask what a company's environmental footprint is, but they ask things like, what are your social policies? How are you looking after your workers? And are you abiding by things like the UN Global Compact for Human Rights? So I think these are very, very concrete ways where the S is ensuring through the deployment of capital that we are making sure that the companies, the investments where capital is driving, where it wants to go, are these responsible companies that can respond to that S question. In the second area, when we talk about unlocking finance or paying for performance, I'd like to touch on 2 things which are somewhat new in the general capital markets arena. And what I mean by that is there's a well-trodden path in the green bond market where companies raise capital and very specifically invest that capital in green. And we have been working very closely with the team at the UN and a whole host of collaborative partners on setting principles for blue bonds. So again, raising capital to invest in blue. But the new thing, if you will, in the capital markets is what we call sustainability-linked finance. And last year, that portion of what I would call the overall green finance capital markets arena was about an $8 billion business. And that grew some 93%. So effectively, grew 100% in 1 year. And the sustainability linked finance world, what it says is if a company wants to raise capital, if the company is prepared to agree that that capital will be tied to a series of metrics that are sustainable, they will attract this form of capital. And it's sort of a reverse incentive in a way that if the company is prepared to hold themselves against those targets, those instruments basically give the company a penalty in the form of a higher cost of capital or higher coupon if they don't meet those metrics. So this is real linkage between delivery of outcomes and what the cost of capital for a company really is. So that's a new phenomenon. And then the final, what I'd say, innovation, if you will, or area of finance, which is really interesting right now, is the topic of engagement. So using your power as a shareholder to engage with companies and ask them, again, to deliver outcomes. And there the incentive is, if you would like my capital, if you'd like me to invest in your company, then you need to engage with me on the things I care about. And that could be setting metrics for delivery around sustainability. So I think, and that is, by the way, one of the fastest growing segments of sustainable finance. So it's captivating to the investor to have this sort of linkages, pay for performance, tying your cost of capital to outcomes and so on. So all of this can very, very easily be directed toward the sustainable seafood arena. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Marisa. That is super interesting. And it's fascinating that it's happening so fast as well. I'm looking forward to discussing this more in a bit. Our next speaker is Mr. Wakao Hanaoka, who's the founder of Seafood Legacy in Tokyo. What are your reflections here on the key enablers, Wakao-san? What is your role in accelerating the developments in seafood?
Yes, thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you for having me at this session. So Seafood Legacy, my organization, is a Tokyo-based sustainable seafood platform and consultation organization. These several years, we've been witnessing some great progress on the movement of seafood sustainability in Japan. For example, the fisheries law was majorly revised. Fisheries and stock management is tightened due to that. Also, a new law on catch documentation and import control rules has established as a measure to IUU fishing. At the same time, more major retailers establish and announce their sustainable and responsible procurement policy, and more major fisheries companies join global platforms such as SeaBoss and announce their initiative and commitment to seafood sustainability and responsibility. Under this like accelerated movement in Japan, I see all enablers listed are important, but to further accelerate the movement in the nation, one of the next keys I see is in the finance sector. So ESG investment is getting more popular in the nation also, but the seafood issue is not yet necessarily on the center part of the agenda yet. From April, a collaboration of organizations, including ourselves, is hosting a series of sustainable seafood finance focusing information sharing and networking webinars, targeting investing banks and institutions in Japan. Another enabler I would like to choose is the number 6, recognizing seafood within a sustainable food system. The Japan EEZ, the 6th largest in the world, is originally very rich and great fishing grounds. By managing the fisheries and the marine environment appropriately, we can recover seafood production in the nation, in the area, and shift Japan from a seafood import country to an exporting country, which contribute to the food supply to the growing world population. Momentum is rising inside the nation. It's time for the Japanese government and industry players in a collaboration with neighboring nations to establish a food strategy as a core part of its green recovery plan and recognize seafood within that strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wakao-san. The momentum is rising. I like the sound of that. That's taking us in the right direction. Francois Mousnet, you're the financial research analyst in Planet Tracker. What are your thoughts on the key enablers?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. And also congratulations for coming up with such a powerful summary of the sprint. Well, like we said before, of course, all 6 enablers are important. But if I had to pick only one, I think I would choose the 5th one you called beyond transparency. So from quantifying progress to rewarding performance. I think it's a very, very important point because all too often, sustainability is pit against financial performance. And so for many company executives or investors, improved sustainability means higher costs. And I think the key is to show that overall a progress in sustainability will be rewarded by investors. And our research at Planet Tracker, we are a financial think tank, is focused on doing exactly that. So Wakao just talked about Japan, so that made me think of a Japanese example, if you want. Let's just stick to one example. But the takeaways of that example can be transposed pretty much everywhere else. So we are actually finalizing research on the Japanese seafood value chain, the entire value chain, all companies exposed to seafood, if you want. And what we show is that over the last 10 years, seafood companies have succeeded in growing sales and profits by effectively bypassing natural capital constraints, the main one being obviously overfished stocks. So even in a country where seafood production and imports have declined over the last decades, companies exposed to the declining resource have grown and were rewarded by investors. And we show why by saying, some techniques were used, such as investing abroad, becoming more vertically integrated, acquiring companies, reducing costs, reducing debt, etc. So that's all good. It allowed companies to grow profits, but the core issue remained. And some of these techniques are reaching the limits. So really, a shift in attitude is needed. And so what we show is that, well, we need to address these issues impacting natural capital. And we also thought about ways where companies exposed to seafood, if you want, can grow in line with nature. So that sounds all cliche, but it's actually very possible. And I don't want to list all of the ways this could be done, but there are actually many ways where you can both improve your sustainability and bottom lines. For instance, we demonstrated that implementing traceability was a profitable investment for seafood processing companies. There are other tools, reducing food waste, removing ghost fishing gear, develop sustainable feeds, etc., etc. Again, I don't want to list them all, but really the point I would like to make is for many company executives, the key is to change attitude on sustainability, be open to see it as a way to grow, accept to disclose data to quantify progress, even if at first it doesn't look at all rosy. And then I think investors will reward improved performance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francois. Interesting reflections there. And yes, a shift in attitude is needed. It's certainly not the case that it has to be that sustainability and profitability does not go hand in hand, because there are several examples of that being possible, as you say. Nigel Edwards is the CSR director of the Hilton Food Group. Curious to hear your thoughts from the food industry perspective, Nigel.
So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. Good afternoon to those in my time zone, at least. And this report is incredibly impressive because it brings together such an array of those that can actually enable this common vision of sustainable seafood into the future. But we're actually on a track that's been going for quite a few years now, as Audun explained with the, it seems only yesterday when the Code of Conduct came out, and that was followed by the Marine Stewardship Council and all the collaborative efforts that have got us to where we are now. But we are reinvigorating this process and bringing all of the finance, government and industry together onto the same track. So I think the really positive side of this is the huge growth potential of aquaculture and fisheries that's highlighted in the report and the ways in which we can achieve this. So it can supply, I think it says, over 6 times the amount of food that is actually produced by those sectors today. And that represents 2/3 of the edible meat that the FAO estimates is needed to actually fulfill the needs of a growing world population. How many food sectors can talk about that growth within planetary boundaries, which actually at the same time is going to deliver a huge positive contribution to the health of the people and of course the health of the planet in the process. So it's an exciting role that we have, that we share here to achieve. So I would say actually that we are very active as a group of seafood companies, and I'm pleased to see some of our supply chains involved in the participants in this, and of course including yourselves, Wenche, with Cermaq. The frameworks that we've got though, we are really important that we engage with them properly. So we welcome the creation of the Blue Finance networks, incorporating seafood specific criteria into existing ESG benchmarks, and building this framework of ocean impact reporting alongside the climate impact. So are we moving into a task force for ocean financial disclosures? I'm not sure, but that recognition of the positive impacts of best practice of seafood companies and as whole value chains working together is really important. And again, although the immediate focus is on the climate crisis, and we do, by the way, need a sector-specific pathway to help us achieve that, science-based targets that we're working on together. We've been talking a lot today about the social certification process, the social evaluation process, and I recognise that is becoming, not just becoming, it has become an absolutely core part of the work that we do together down our supply chains in cooperation. So yes, we have ILO 188. It's nowhere near enough countries ratifying it. And we are building frameworks such as that we're involved in the Responsible Fishing Vessel Scheme, which align to ILO 188, give the opportunities for the fishers to actually demonstrate compliance and show that they're doing the right thing with their crews. But what's our role in this? Well, we bring by using these robust certification standards, by bringing this transparency, what we're doing is giving a clear market pull, but at the same time, by understanding what the consumer wants and giving them that information, we are actually helping the consumer, to enabling them to choose that diet that for them is healthy for them and healthy for the planet. And so if we can build this radical transparency of standards that's going to drive these improvements, if we can get funding to adopt the electronic transparency and traceability and data collection that's needed, then this collaboration is going to give the industry a clear license for growth. And what we can achieve with fisheries and aquaculture is probably the best opportunity that any of the protein sectors have got to contribute to this food future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nigel. Yes, we need a clear license to growth, and there's certainly many elements to build up on in that regard. Jean-Baptiste, I'm sure you're bursting with questions now to follow up with our panelists.
Thanks,
Should we start a discussion?
Yeah, and thank you above all to all 5 panelists. I think we heard a lot of interesting things from the role of governments and existing but evolving regulatory frameworks, to the appetite of the financial sector and awareness raising, to success stories or less successful stories with concrete example from Japan and from Francois, up to the role of course of consumer and the potential of seafood as a healthy source of protein for diets, but also for the environment. And to that, I will add that, of course, under the umbrella of seafood, there is a lot of heterogeneity, and that today we're talking about accelerating sustainable seafood, but it is also important to recognize what is seafood, and that it actually ranges from mussels and seaweeds to bluefin tuna, with everything in between. And that aspect, that heterogeneity of the seafood sector matters as well when we talk about sustainability. But to kick off the panel discussion, let me maybe turn back to our first speaker, Audun, and ask you a little bit about the agenda, because we are starting 2021. It is the beginning of the UN Decade for Ocean Science, a UN Decade of Ocean Action, but it is also the year with the upcoming UN Food System dialogues and the COP26 at the end of the fall. So how can these arenas contribute to strengthen the collective efforts and be used as leverage point to accelerate sustainable seafood?
Thank you for that. I think that one of the problems we've had in the sector and still have in the sector is that we are looking too much inwards. We are looking too much at the sector itself and not at the linkages between our sector and the food sector in general and wider society. And I think both these two events that you mentioned, both the UN Food Systems dialogues and the COP26, are important venues for us to show that we are not a problem, but we are part of the solution. That the seafood sector has so much to contribute, that it's not just about seafood, it's about food, it's about food systems, it's about nutrition. And therefore, I think it's so important for us to integrate our discussions in the wider debate on food, the wider debate on food systems, the wider debate on climate change, both how we can mitigate climate change and how we can ensure that the seafood sector remains resilient and can cope with climate change, and also nutrition. So I think both these two events are great opportunities for us to show how important we are also for the broader solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Audun. I'll pass the same question on actually to you, Marisa. How do you think the investor community will engage in the UN Food System Dialogue and the COP26 this year?
The financial system is very, very keen, as I indicated earlier, to deploy capital into sustainable strategies. So there's a great enthusiasm to identify more places to put capital to work under some sort of common framework. So I think there's no doubt that the capital is there and wanting to invest. You know, we've seen just almost literally, a linear straight up growth in capital being put into sustainable models. What the sustainable sector, though, on the finance side is calling for, though, are some commonality of metrics. I mean, we've raised this a little bit here through this discussion today, but also with the Sprint findings, is if we can all agree as a collective on what are the financially material line items that really will move the needle for a company and for the sector, that is what helps the community scale. They're looking for consistency and an ability to compare and contrast across companies to determine who really is sustainable, and Francois brought that up a little bit as well. So the more of the consistency that we can get, but also the more of the agreement of what are those line items that need to be disclosed, that'll drive that behavior change that will then attract the capital. So I guess that's what I would see as we go into the latter part of this year. There is a very big push and a drive to consolidate the ESG rating services. There's a drive to consolidate the standards for disclosure in sustainability. And I'm hopeful that as a collective, we can come up together with what are those items that matter to the sustainable seafood industry.
Thank you, Marisa. And this is also an encouragement to all the attendees to use the Q&A function on the webinar to actually ask a question. I think I'll pick one there from Dave Robb and merge it with one to you, Francois. So the idea is like, which opportunities or topics for collaboration do you see relevant to scale up sustainable seafood production, right? Like Dave is explaining that one needs to address the market value of sustainable seafood. If the market is fixed on buying the cheapest solution, will the industry be able to transform at scale? And I think this notion of scaling up, the scale and pace of this transformation of seafood is really important. So one answer is probably the collective and collaborative effort across the value chain. But what is your take on it?
I think it's a great question, but difficult to answer because there's so many avenues for collaborations. I always like to focus on specific points that can be addressed easily, and if you go from easy low-hanging fruit, if you want, there are many existing initiatives, right? When you come in the sector relatively new, like I was a few years ago, you discover many initiatives. You have the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, a Global Ghost Gear initiative. So effectively, for every specific issues, there is an initiative. Except politics, if you want, I don't see why this initiative could not be brought more together. So that's something that effectively companies could leverage better, probably. And then, like Marisa pointed, very eloquently, the issue is about data, a collaboration on data. There are actually lots of data available, but it's just that either it's not disclosed. For instance, most companies actually don't report the volumes of species they catch, and that would be tremendously helpful to assess sustainability. And that's data that is readily available. But it could have also larger implications, for instance, to help reduce illegal fishing and fight the S part that as we discussed. For instance, now, if I want to really link an investor to IU fishing, I would have to go through the list of all the vessels published by RFMO. TrigMat tracking, for instance, would do that. Then I can track the vessel. Then I can find who's the owner of that vessel. Then I can find where the vessel stopped, in which port. And I can actually, link an investor to IU fishing, but it takes time. I can imagine that, in 5 years' time, for instance, this could all be done automatically. And that would necessitate very simply just collaboration between diverse organizations, if you want. And then a third point, because it caught me that we really mentioned the word blue bond a lot today, and that's effectively, like Marisa pointed out, investors are ready for this solution. There is a demand for this solution, and we can easily design a blue bond that would reduce that would basically trigger a recovery in fish stock that would be profitable for investors and for fishing companies. But what we need really is businesses, investors, and governments to come together and agree on a few things. Well, a few things, very, very big challenges, but yeah, so that's basically what needs to be done.
Baptiste, may I just jump in there to elaborate on what Francois said, which is to give us hope that we are heading in the right direction. One initiative, and this is all dancing around this topic of, can we get a consistency of data and agreement across the public sector, the private sector, the consumer sector, et cetera, on what it is that we want to drive toward. And so in that respect, one of the areas that's been either not priced or mispriced is natural capital solutions. How do you price natural capital? How do you price these externalities that the markets haven't taken into consideration yet? And there's an initiative, it was mentioned a little bit, Nigel talked about TCFD. There's an initiative called TNFD now, which is the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure, which is a very large and ever-growing group of people from governments, Swiss government, UK government, many others, NGOs, finance providers, and so on, all coming together to say, let's link arms and ask ourselves what matters. What is that data we need? Is it tracking those individual vessels or whatever it is? If we all agree on what it is, then we can easily find the data, make the data easily accessible, potentially create incentives at a policy level to force people to disclose the data. And then the finance community says, great, I've got the data, everybody agrees it's important data, I want to invest behind the data. It sounds very simple, obviously in practice it's much more complicated, but I am really encouraged by the fact that we have this many people coming together across these different avenues, all driving toward identifying what those line items are.
Thank you, Marisa. And I think this is a point that echoes one of the questions we received about the idea of rewarding biodiversity preservation, right? Indeed, as much as there is momentum and growing awareness in the financial sector, much of it so far has focused on climate and the risk of climate and relatively little on the awareness of biodiversity. And I think what you pointed out is is a direct answer. And the, the attendee was Julia Sigwart, was particularly pointing out to some risk associated with the expansion of global aquaculture that is indeed foreseen as a massive growth potential, with some risk and invasive species on some natural habitats. So I think there too, taking those that nature framework and
Yes.
encompassing non-financial biodiversity factors into financing mechanisms can be really helpful to incentivize better practices.
Very good. I'd like to ask a question to Nigel to follow up on his quote there on radical transparency. How do you see, so now this TNFD framework, you mentioned potentially a TFCD ocean framework. How do you see this discussion in terms of the follow-up of the industry? Is this moving in the right direction there, you think?
I think the UN Food Systems Summit could be a fantastic opportunity to take these processes further. We've got to see this in the context of food, particularly protein sector in general, that we're looking to the role of food in, well, we talked about climate, but also social equality as well, and what it delivers for people, don't forget that. But I think the seafood sector has been on a biodiversity track for a long time. We've had protecting vulnerable marine ecosystems as part of certification standards, and those certification standards have been largely built around ecosystem management of oceans and or freshwater systems anyway. So I think we're probably a little bit ahead in the seafood sector of our awareness of our impacts on the environment, the last hunted resource, etc., etc. But I would think we can work in cooperation with proteins of all different kinds. We have this huge opportunity for growth, but we share a lot of the raw material challenges, the soy challenge, for instance, with and we really welcome the steps that have been taken in that area. There's been a leadership position in the feed for salmon, in the addressing deforestation in the soy supply chains, at the first sector to set a complete deforestation-free cutoff date in 2020, for instance. But these aren't happening across all sectors. It's shared challenges, and I think we should look at setting these goals for whether they be climate, diversity, biodiversity, or social goals in cooperation with other food sectors. We have one planet.
This is absolutely a good point. One planet, one ocean as well. There's no planet B, but there is certainly no ocean B. I mean, I'm a big fan of concrete examples, and I know last year was quite a year for Japan and their relationship to seafood and the role of regulators there. So, Wakao, could you just briefly outline the two big reforms that happened at the end of the year, if I believe, in 2020 in Japan, which really have the potential to transform Japanese seafood?
Yes, thank you. First one is the reform of the whole fisheries law, the major fisheries law. This big scale of reform was first time in our 70-year history, so it's a huge one. 70 years ago, the law was established. The purpose was more for fishermen to fish as much as possible without fighting with each other. So the sustainability elements was not there. And I was surprised that for 70 years, the same law were alive. But finally, it was great that now the purpose of the law, it mentions that the sustainable use of the marine resources, and they tightened the stock assessment, stock management, transparency, all those elements. The second law established it. So the first law was, the implementation was started last year. The second thing is the establishment of the law of the import controls and catch documentation for IUU measure. The implementation will start in 2 years, so we have 2 years to prepare to make like smaller regulations. Yes, but it's as Japan followed following EU and US, Japan is the third biggest seafood importing market. So Japan having those import control regulation, we believe that it's great on contributing to the global efforts on eliminating IUU.
Very nice. Before we wrap, we're actually almost at the end of our hour today. So before you wrap up, Jean-Baptiste, I would like to ask you, Audun, a final question. How do you see multi-stakeholder groups engaging the attendance of this webinar? How do you see us engaging in the UN Food System Summit later this year? You have one of the action tracks leads, right? Would love to hear some of your thoughts on how we can move forward in the summit.
Well, in FAO, of course, we work a lot with policymakers, but we also work with the private sector, with companies, not so much with individual companies, but associations and networks and platforms. And I think it's very important for us to get sort of direct contact with the concerns of business, but also to understand better how the various policy decisions can be implemented by companies, because at the end of the day, it's not the countries as such which have to achieve the SDGs. It's the consumers and the citizens of the world. So the participation, the active participation by companies and by platforms like this is fundamental to that. And in preparing our inputs, we will of course take that into account and work with you and others in doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Audun.
Still have 3 minutes. I'm going to try to squeeze another question because they keep coming. So I'm going to try to merge a few of them for Marisa. And like, it's the recognition of this momentum, as we said, around green-blue finance. But again, pace and scale doesn't necessarily match the urgency of the situation faced by the industry, right? And so we have one question. It's going to be twofold. The first one is whether there is enough appetite among credit lenders and investors to organize the systematic joint approach for applying the same reference points in sustainably linked finance. So how can those sustainably linked finance becomes kind of the norm rather than the exception? Today, they are the exception, and they are praised, but they are the exception. And the second aspect to that is also, how does then large-scale financing does large-scale financing have a mechanisms for investing in fisheries in a way that doesn't disadvantage the small-scale operation? And I think this is a bit the two dimension of finance we talked about, like the impact finance, but also the corporate finance. Just a few words very briefly, if you can.
Yeah. A lot to cover in a few words. I guess in short, the way that that I think we can scale the finance headed toward the space is to come together and agree on what are those most important financially material metrics. I keep going back to that because if we can come up with that, the finance will follow, because the finance is sitting on the sidelines wanting to invest in an informed way. It's just that it doesn't always know from either climate science or good proof points or what have you, what are those good things. And so if we can agree on that, I am absolutely confident the finance will follow in scale and size. To your question about if we scale, are we going to somehow leave behind the smallholder fishermen and those who are critical to the overall ecosystem, and particularly on focusing on us? There are many forms of finance. There's a large liquid capital markets that tend to want to invest big pools of capital in traded instruments and companies, but there are also many, many lenders all over the world who make their living on providing loan capital to companies and to small businesses. And I think those loan providers, if they can incorporate, as we've said in one of the interventions here in the report, into their loan covenants sustainability metrics, then the companies who are sustainable naturally will have access to that capital. And that then becomes a self-feeding thing. And those parts of the ecosystem aren't left behind. And the final way that we often see this as well is by pooled capital. So you might have a fund that is looking to invest in sustainable aquaculture, and it goes across different types of companies. So it's pooled at the senior level, but it makes lots of little investments. And then you, as an investor, have a diverse portfolio. So many different structures to accomplish this and make sure that we don't leave behind smallholders.
Thank you so much, Marisa. A big thank you to all 5 panelists today. There are obviously a numbers of where the sustainable development of seafood can be accelerated, and the actions we discussed and we outlined today are by no means exhaustive, but there were those consistently referenced by participants during the sprint. But of course, and we've heard it and we've read it in some of the questions, there is the role of some actors that do not take part in some initiatives, some big countries. There is also the notion of women and the role of women in fisheries and small-scale artisanal fisheries. So as many topics that we could dive and do more sprints about. But once again, on behalf of the UN Global Action Platform and everyone else involved, thank you for joining, thank you for attending, and hopefully the report can provide some useful resources.
Thank you, everyone. Go have a look at the report. It's worth it.